Hello and welcome to the podcast. Donald Trump, now luxuriating in the finest hospitality the British establishment can provide, makes no secret of his dislike of the BBC, nor does his most recent best buddy, Elon Musk, who regularly blasts what he has called the State Broadcasting Corporation, and said at the Trafalgar Square rally on Saturday that the BBC was complicit in the destruction of Britain, as well as saying that the left is the party of murder. The right-wing press in this country has consistently attacked the corporation for left-wing bias. One of its most regular critics is a former BBC journalist, Robin Aitken, who writes for the Daily Telegraph. 18 years ago, he wrote a book called Can We Trust the BBC? He followed that up 5 years later with another called Can We Still Trust the BBC? And in 2018 wrote The Noble Liar, another critique of the corporation. This month, Mr. Aitken returns to the attack, contributing a chapter to a new book called The BBC, After the Licence Fee? I also contributed a rather different chapter. In his, Robin Aitken says, the BBC is profoundly hostile to a right-wing world view. I was keen to explore Mr. Aitken's views further. Robin Aitken, welcome to the podcast. 18 years ago, you published a book called Can We Trust the BBC? 18 years later, can we?
On some things, yes. I mean, the weather forecast, the cricket score, that I'm happy to take from the BBC. The question I posed in the title of that book was this, that what lay behind that question is this. The BBC has an internal culture. It has a political culture. And that culture informs its worldview. And I'm not saying that that worldview is wrong. It's not my worldview. The point about the BBC is it claims impartiality, but not everyone shares the same worldview as it. And so that is what lay behind that title, because I think that people don't always understand that BBC does have a coherent internal political culture.
Well, you then published a book that later called The Noble Liar, How the BBC Distorts the News to Promote a Liberal Agenda. So the worldview you're talking about is a liberal view. How can you spot it from your perspective?
If you come from my sort of background, which is, the current phrase that people use is a socially conservative background. So I come from a Catholic background and my faith is important to me. So take an issue like the assisted dying debate or indeed abortion. I find regularly that when the BBC touches on the question of abortion, it very rarely gives equal weight to the two sides. What you'll find is that if there is any curtailment of so-called abortion rights in any country, be it Brazil or America, that becomes headline news. But the assumption behind that story, the way the BBC reports that particular story, is always that an extension of abortion rights, making the availability of abortion easier is always a good thing. That's what I mean.
Well, could I just to pick you up on this point, which is to say that I agree with, I think, a lot of what is behind what you're saying, in the sense that the BBC has consistently undervalued the importance of religion and the religious perspective, and that to that extent, young people being, in the BBC at lower levels, on the whole, coming from a liberal and on the whole from a non-religious background, undervalue but underreport that perspective. So I would sympathise and agree with you that that aspect is missing. I noticed when I was presenting the Sunday programme for BBC Radio 4 that the evangelicals, who got themselves in a lot of trouble for various statements, were very rarely, there was not often an attempt to understand where they were coming from. Where they were coming from was obviously a question of biblical authority. Now, whether you accepted biblical authority or not, that was a coherent position. Just it's a coherent position to come from a view about human rights, which would take you in a different direction. But I agree with you on those issues, the undervaluing of religion. But it's one thing to move from that area to make the claim that, say, in foreign coverage, in the coverage of a whole range of other areas, that so-called liberal agenda or non-faith agenda is at work. And you do make that because you, in the book, in the latest chapter that you've written in the book called The BBC After the Licence Fee, you talk about that liberal bias being evident really across the board, including the reporting of Israel and elsewhere.
Well, let's unpick that a bit. If you take, I'm thinking back to 2016 and to Trump's first term in office. The BBC, in the run-up to that unexpected result, was quite dismissive. I mean, hardly took Trump seriously at all, when unexpectedly he beat Hillary Clinton and became president. The BBC went into a panic mode almost. Its coverage of Trump in those first few months in 2016 was frankly absurd.
Yeah, there's one thing to say it's absurd and poor reporting. It's another to allege that the reason for what you would see as poor reporting is a liberal bias. I mean, what we have subsequently had from people like Justin Webb, very thoughtfully, I think, of the Today programme, is the fact what actually journalists like him, when in America, got wrong, had been that they concentrated on what people in New York and Washington and perhaps San Francisco had thought, and they'd missed out entirely what was going on in whole significant parts of the United States. Now, that surely could be argued is poor journalism because you're sticking in the centres of power and not getting out. It's another thing to say, actually, no, it's the result of liberal bias.
I'm sure you've worked in Washington. I have briefly at various points in my career. And you will know, as became very clearly apparent to me very quickly, that the American press corps in DC is extremely weighted towards the Democrats. And of course, that's quite a coercive environment to be working in. But what I saw from my BBC colleagues there was they were very happy in that milieu. Look, I have great respect for Justin, actually. I think he's an excellent reporter. And I think his commentary on American politics is the best thing the BBC does on American politics. So I have no quarrel with you there at all. What I'm saying is that looked at in the broadest possible spectrum, the BBC will, in its coverage, generally take as a starting point for the coverage of an issue a point which it considers to be non-controversial, but is always on the liberal left side of the equation. Now, not extremely so, but for instance, I think, Roger, that there is an assumption in the BBC, broadly speaking, that public is always better than private, so that a social democratic government anywhere in the world is always going to be preferable to what the BBC often terms as far right. And the way that they use those terms is itself such a giveaway. These terms, of course, are not open to exact definition. But what is far right? What does far right actually mean?
Oh, well, I would give you a definition broadly. Far right would be that which is out with the democratic process, and that part which actually may be determined to get rid of the democratic process. So you would define far right as one, you wouldn't define conservatism as far right, you wouldn't want to define anybody who worked within a parliamentary...
What about the AfD?
We're talking about Germany now and that those connections and the way it treats Hitler in the past and whatever. Yeah, that's an interesting area. But can I go back to this question of the BBC? Because you use this term as if it's singular, the BBC. There is a worldview, as you know, backwards from working in it. There are a raft of making decisions all the time. There are lots of people with different political views. There's furious rows about running orders. There's stuff like that. So when I hear people say the BBC thinks, I don't think there is a BBC that thinks in that way. There are a raft of journalists, some are curmudgeonly, whatever, and there are editorial decisions making overall. And the likelihood of a basic conspiracy is ridiculous. I mean, you work for a newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which publishes claims by people that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
It's one No, I mean, actually, you see, what's this institutional bit? I don't see it. I mean, if we started from saying that younger people joining the BBC tend to be liberal, tend to be sceptical, tend to, because we're still dominated by London and whatever, tend to move in too narrow circles. If we decided to talk about that, we'd agree. If we said the BBC sometimes doesn't have a wide enough range of perspectives that have a lot of truth, but you worked for news editors who are hard-bitten figures. The BBC consistently provides people for Downing Street spokesmen for Conservative governments from their leadership. Yeah. I mean, Robbie Gibb is still sitting there, whatever. There isn't this thing. I'm just surprised that somebody like you with the experience talks about the BBC view. Maybe a view is too dominant. That's one thing, but a BBC view, there isn't one.
Let's go back a bit. This idea of institutional bias was ushered into the lexicon by Macpherson and the so-called institutional racism of the Metropolitan Police. I thought it was a nonsense at the time. I think that it was a way of reinforcing a doctrinaire political correctness on the police, and we see the trouble that has caused.
Now, what about this point about there is this central decision making?
Hang on a second. You said in what you just said, you used the word conspiratorial and conspiracy. I have never alleged that there is any sort of conspiracy within the BBC, because I think that's an absolute nonsense.
You think it's an unconscious bias that?
No, what I think is this, and I think it was most clearly demonstrated during the Brexit debate. Now, there's an organisation which was funded by a Scottish peer, and he paid out of his own pocket for years-long scrutiny of BBC output, and they monitored BBC output on this specific issue of Brexit. And for a couple of decades, the truth is that the amount of time devoted to the Brexit side of the argument, the leavers, was minuscule compared with the amount of coverage which was given to the Remainers side of the argument. Now, that wasn't a conspiracy. The problem here is this. Inside the BBC, the view that Britain should have remained in the EU was non-controversial. Why was it non-controversial? Because 95% of all the BBC journalists would have felt that to remain was the right thing.
I don't know. How on earth do you know that?
If you were like me, I mean, actually, as it happens, I voted to remain, as it happens. A terrible admission, but nevertheless true. And I did so on the basis that although my heart said leave, my head said this will be better for the economy if we stay. And I think that's once the decision was made, I bitterly regretted not having voted leave, as it happens. But the tone of the coverage of the BBC was, from the start of that debate, that the idea of leaving was almost unthinkable, that it was damaging to the country's... This phrase about it being a self-inflicted wound came up over and over and over again. And then this idea that it was the leavers who were the liars. But actually, wasn't there a lie from the very start of the Remain position, which was that the EU was never a political project? Which it was. I mean...
Well, hold on, Robin, hold on. Sorry. First of all, you're absolutely right, by the way, about it was a political project, and certainly it was the intention of Jean Monnet and others to create...
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
it was.
Doesn't mean...
And Remainers, Europhiles lied about that for 30 years.
Well, they didn't talk about it. I agree. On the other hand, once a thing is in existence, its purposes change and people support it for different reasons. But you're absolutely right to say it began as a political project, and those who began it did want to have a vision of a federal Europe. That's absolutely true. That's a fact. But going on to the debate itself about Europe, you see, it is through the eyes. I mean, you have someone like John Sopel, for example, who is now writing how scandalous the BBC coverage of Brexit was. The Remain case was not heard or put in properly. And I would say that, there are two things, on the whole, there are two things going wrong here. The first is that until one of the major political parties adopts a position, the BBC often is scared, if you like, of questioning something. It follows fundamentally a parliamentary agenda. It moved on Brexit at the point at which one of the major parties then moved. That, I would say, is more likely. The second thing is that my criticism of Brexit coverage would be that it only dealt with the first part of the argument about should we leave? The second part of the argument should have been, what are we leaving for? Now, here, 4 or 5 years later, we're still arguing this. In other words, you're asking for people to jump, but you're not saying where they're going to land. And you can see that situation, I may say, in Ireland, where Ireland is moving to probably supporting the idea of a united Ireland.
Possibly.
But a lot of problems, but probably. But I have yet to see a proper examination of what sort of Ireland. And this is so to say that the BBC got Brexit wrong in a way. My criticism was it didn't have the courage to say the politicians are saying this and that, but you, of the public, have a right to have answers to these questions, which are: what sort of society did we want? What sort of economic policies did we want once we've left? How do we intend, as a country, to use the freedoms which are promised? We didn't have that debate, and actually, you can argue the Conservative Party didn't have that debate as well.
Well, there is truth in what you say, but then you're asking something of the general public, which I don't think it's capable of delivering, which is that, people like you and me and the people who are watching this podcast and people who read serious newspapers and news magazines are in a minority. I would guess no higher than sort of 15 to 20% at the maximum of people who are politically engaged in the way that you suggest. Most people out there, and I know this from years of dealing with people in all sorts of walks of life right across the country. Most people, their attitude to politics is that it's something which is happening in the background, and occasionally they are required to concentrate on it because they're asked to cast their vote. And when they cast their vote basically on gut instinct. How am I doing? How am my family doing? Do I like the look of this lot or not? They don't go into things terribly deeply. You're talking about the sort of programming which would appeal to the likes of you and me. But we are a minority.
No, I'm talking about the programming. That might be the case, that as you have an obligation as a public service broadcaster to ensure the public is properly informed, because before it takes one of the most major decisions ever taken since the Second World War. And if you say there's no role for a public service broadcaster to do that, what we're going to do is, look, you're faced with a situation of hopeless prejudice on both sides. You look, please, where can I find somewhere? Just tell me the facts. On the whole, in my view, the BBC does it. On the whole, you don't. But,
Yeah, I mean, look.
I'm just saying we left without knowing where we're going to land.
I know. Well, that's very true. But, the point is that people were fed up with the EU because actually, what it came down to is, this is my firm belief, that there were a group of people who felt disadvantaged and left behind and totally ignored. There was that group of people. And there was a group of people led by the likes of Bill Cash, the Tory MP, who had a fundamental objection to the idea of pooling our sovereignty so that we didn't make our own laws. And that was a very principled position. But that was a minority in the Leave position. Anyway, we could talk forever about this.
Yeah, the question is whether the BBC was biased. You see, you're saying the BBC's coverage was biased.
I believe it wasn't. Look, okay, bias. What is bias? Bias is partly the way that we all seek out and want to hear those opinions and those reports which affirm our own position, right? So I am biased, and I admit this, I'm biased in the sense that I like to read, I like to hear, I like to watch things which affirm my Christian viewpoint, for one thing. From a Catholic viewpoint, I like to hear things which affirm my conservative instincts about things like policing.
And you should surely have the right to have that available to you. But don't you think side by side with that, you need an organisation which says, on the whole, we'll try and present the information the best we can, and the other side?
Look, I said in my the very first thing I left the BBC specifically to allow myself to write the first book that I wrote, Can We Trust the BBC? It's not a very good book, actually, looking back on it. But one thing I say in that is that the ideal of a public service broadcaster, which is untainted by sectional interest and which is impartial and unbiased, is a wonderful ideal. And that any democracy which had that as an information source would have a gift of priceless worth. And so the ideal of the BBC, I thoroughly applaud. It's just that in reality, it strives for the ideal, but it falls well short. And that is only apparent if you stand outside the political consensus, which I found in every single BBC newsroom I ever worked in, which was a lot. You know, I worked in BBC Scotland, for instance, I'd worked up there for 5 years as an economics and business correspondent. And the prejudice against Thatcher was so, you could cut it with a knife, you could carve blocks off it. They hated her. And the BBC itself in Scotland was wholly invested in the idea that Thatcherism was wicked. And I came to it as an Englishman. I didn't think that Thatcher was wicked. I thought that she did things which were necessary, although tough. That was an experience for me. That was lived experience of the kind of bias which I'm talking about.
Well, I'd love to discussion of that, but I must move you to one thing. And going back to this chapter in the book you've written, you quote a saying of Kemi Badenoch that she has come to agree with Dominic Cummings that the BBC is the, and you quote, mortal enemy of conservatism. Do you share that view?
Okay, here's something which grieves me. One of BBC One's latest offerings is called Honeymoon Island. It's a trash spin-off, and I think we can all guess what it's about. It's about gathering young nubiles together on an island on their honeymoon and let them going at it. That is absolute trash culture.
Well, I would agree with that. Hold on, I agree with that. But hold on. It's a long way from saying, hold on, what I asked you, no, what I said to you was not, is the BBC put on trash? Does the BBC put on a whole lot of stuff which you, and particularly as a conservative, as you would describe yourself, Christian, disagree with? But the specific quote from Dominic Cummings was more than that, wasn't it? That the BBC is the mortal enemy of conservatism. Now, there's plenty of immorality in conservative circles as there are elsewhere. Yes. But the mortal enemy of conservatism, that implies the BBC is irredeemable. You surely think it's redeemable.
Well, I have lived in hope for the past 30 years that it is redeemable, because this is another point I make often when I'm writing about this subject. I make the point that for any conservative, I mean a small c conservative, conservatives should not be in the business of tearing down the edifice of fine old institutions. But every institution, from the law to the BBC, including everything else, from time to time needs a reforming overhaul. Now, I would say this, Roger, that when Cummings wrote that, which was back in the early noughties, so at least 20 years ago, probably longer, I think that at that point, the BBC was in an even worse position than it is now. I think, actually, that I was watching Tim Davie at the Media Culture Sport Committee yesterday. There was a select committee hearing yesterday.
Yeah, I watched it too on Tuesday in the House, yeah.
And what is fascinating to me is that whereas if I go back to when I left the BBC to write this book, which was 2007, then the BBC had this carapace of cast iron confidence about itself and about its absolute rightness and its inability to do wrong. I think that has changed. I think that the self-confidence of the BBC about its impartiality has been dented. And I think that Tim Davie knows full well, because he said his first day when he came into the job 5 years ago, first thing he said when he came in, the number one priority is to restore impartiality. And implicit in that was the idea that they had not managed to achieve impartiality in the way the BBC always said it wants.
Well, a cynic would say he was coming in where the Conservative government was preoccupied with this issue, and it was a very sensible move of Director General who wished to have a licence fee and a charter renewed and a decent licence fee, that he should acknowledge their concerns. However, anyway, let's move away from that cynical perspective. I want to pick one other thing from your chapter that you've written in this book. I would recommend, by the way, to listeners this book, The BBC After the Licence Fee. and not because I've got a chapter in it too, which you can disregard. But anyway, you were saying that 85% of voters, or you report the fact that 85% of people who listen to GB News don't trust the BBC. And the BBC itself, internally, is discussing how it can reach out to those voters. How do you think it can reach out to those voters, and should it? Because the other side of the argument is that, by George, it doesn't have to stoke up conspiracy GB News. It doesn't have to often take an individual example, and generalise without providing context. It kicks the BBC at every possible occasion, doesn't it? I mean, you don't go GB News for impartial news. So how should the BBC appeal to those voters who focus and get most of their information from GB News, if not social media?
Well, I've long been of the view, actually, that one of the things that the BBC needs to do is to reevaluate what the word diversity means. So I think that the BBC's view of diversity is like a Dulux colour chart. If we've got some white people and we've got some brown people and we've got some black people, and if we've got them in sufficient correct proportions, then we're doing our job. And the same goes for the sexual spectrum from homo to hetero. So, I mean, that is the BBC's view of diversity. What it leaves out is the most important diversity of all, which is intellectual and political diversity. There aren't enough journalists in the BBC who are conservatives, that is, to the right of the political spectrum. So the only way of addressing this problem is to get a better balance, better political balance within newsrooms. Now, there is a story, apocryphal maybe, I don't know. I don't know what the truth of this is, I've never found out. But apparently there was a producer at Pebble Mill back in the 80s who paid for a opinion poll survey of the political views of BBC staff. And Lord knows what he was thinking, because when this survey was prepared and available, it was instantly buried in the archive, never to be seen again, and no one knows what the result of that was. And I can well believe that no BBC boss in his right mind would want such a survey either commissioned or published.
Yeah, but hold on. You haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. You don't even exist. Come on, you're a journalist. We can't have a discussion based upon something that may or may not have happened.
Well, that's journalism.
No, that's not journalism. Come on. No, what I was going to say,
no,
but
okay.
But I mean, what would you? Okay, what I'm a bit baffled about, the idea, not that your analysis is in many ways may well be in many ways correct, a greater diversity of attitudes and politics, recruiting more widely, a suspicion of the danger of a liberal consensus and the need to obviously watch out for that and so on. I recognise all of that. But there we are. There are a lot of people in the BBC who strangely then who are conservative, who become head of Westminster, Robbie Gibb, who then run the communications operation for Conservative Prime Ministers, Robbie Gibb again, and of course one or two others that we can think of. And then
it's funny how you can only find one name.
Well, hold on, no, good to Harry. You can have a few more.
Yeah.
I can give you a few more. Then, of course, Robbie Gibb is back in the BBC as a non-exec director sitting on content boards. I mean, the idea that he and lots of others. By the way, the Director General Tim Davie at one stage in his career was a Conservative candidate at a council election. I mean, the idea of this place being run by card-carrying liberals leading to the left is not the case. It just isn't true. There's no it. I just don't understand.
I just have to disagree with you there. I mean, one swallow does not make a conservative.
Well, if I could tell you four swallows, come on. I mean, okay. But you're saying they're the exception, but they do tend to Mr. Oliver, who was ran the news at 10 for the BBC, turns out and then goes to it and runs communications at number 10 for the Conservative Prime Minister as well. I could keep going on this,
Yeah. Well, there is a chapter in my first book actually, which details the number of people who left the BBC to go and work for Tony Blair and have worked for Labour, and there was an absolute flock of them.
Oh, no, I'm sure that's true. No, that's true. It doesn't disprove my point.
If you remember, at that time, we had as Director General, we had someone who had donated to the Labour Party, who was John Birt, and we had Gavin Davis, who was the chairman of the governors, and he was another donor to the Labour Party.
Hold on, I have to correct you on one point. I think you've mistaken John Birt there for Greg Dyke. I think it was Greg Dyke who contributed to the Labour Party. I don't know if John Birt has ever done so. But you're right about Greg Dyke, and you'll be right also about the chairman. Sorry.
And at that time, I remember actually talking to Polly Toynbee's husband, the great Peter Jenkins, about this. And he was, at that time, he was worried about the way that no one was batting an eyelid about the way that the BBC hierarchy was at that time, this was during the Blair ascendancy, was stacked with Blairites. And the BBC was never as happy. I remember coming back into Television Centre on the night of the 1997 election, having just interviewed Ted Heath, who held his seat. And I came back into the newsroom that evening, and it was awash with joy because Labour had won. And it was just an upwelling of quite genuine emotion that Labour was back in power.
Hold on a second. I would agree with you on that. I agree that there were too many people who were too close to the Labour Party at the top of the BBC at that time. I was just trying to make the point there have been a large number of people who've gone from the top of the BBC subsequently to work for Conservative Prime Ministers.
Not a large number. A few. A very few.
We talked about Craig Oliver, we talked about Guto Harry, we've talked about Robbie Gibb. I mean, I can go a bit further. There are a lot. What you have, in my view, failed to say, you've pointed out correctly, BBC maybe gets too close to political parties, but to argue that it is consistently biased. Anyway, we'll never agree about that. But I want to ask you one final question about this. No, two questions. So the first one is, how can you work for Daily Telegraph newspaper, which is so extreme in its criticism of the BBC? Don't you occasionally want to write something to them or go to an editorial conference to say, oh, come on, you've got to have some light and shade here? And do you want to be associated with some of the things they say?
You might have noticed, you probably haven't, because why would you? You'd have to be an obsessive to have noticed. But I haven't written much for the Telegraph because in the last 18 months, and because actually you put your finger on something. I am tired of writing the same thing about the BBC. And I sometimes think that I'm asked to write stuff which I think, well, actually, I'm not very interested in writing this, because knocking copy about the BBC is a tired old game for me now. And my view of the BBC is slightly more nuanced than I think you're giving me credit for. I do think that the BBC has made an honest attempt to try to reform itself in some respects. In regard to impartiality, as I was trying to enunciate in that last answer we were talking about a moment ago, I think the BBC's rather arrogant assumption it's always in the right and it has nothing to answer for on these matters is actually cracking, that it actually now does understand that it hasn't fulfilled, as it should have done, its pledge to impartiality. And the proof of that, Roger, is that last year alone, it lost 300,000 households who refused to pay their licence fee. Why are people not paying their licence fee? It's because, partly the reason is, because a lot of people have been sensitized to this question of the BBC's lack of impartiality. And they've turned away from the BBC because they don't see and hear their views, their outlook reflected in the BBC's output. And that has turned them off the BBC. Now, that is a problem for the BBC. I don't wish to see the BBC destroyed. What I want to see is a BBC true to the purpose that it proclaims for itself. That's all I've ever wanted to see. But the BBC, when I first made these arguments back in 2007, I was a real outlier. And I think I was, I'm not blowing my own trumpet at all on this, because I think at best I will have had a very marginal effect, if any effect, on the BBC. But I was an outlier. I came out and I said who I was. I said I'd been a BBC reporter. This was my lived experience. Don't like the phrase, but that's stuck with it. It was my lived experience of working for the BBC as a reporter for 25 years, and this is what I found. And I came out and I wrote that book, not a very good book, as I say. And actually, since that time, there has been a growing, swelling chorus of disapproval, of discontent about the BBC on this very subject, about its lack of impartiality. Many people now are prepared to come out and say it, and it's become quite an issue. So I was, if you like, a bit of ahead of the wave. But I do think the BBC has become aware of this. And what I want to see is the BBC take this thing even more seriously, correct its internal biases, and get back to what we require of it, which is to be a national information source which we can all trust. And that isn't true at the moment.
Robin Aitken, thank you very much. But I'm reflecting on that old saw from a former BBC boss who said, when the country is divided, the BBC is on the rack. Thank you very much for talking to us. Our thanks to Robin Aitken. And the book to which he and I and many others have contributed essays is called The BBC After the Licence Fee, and is edited by John Mayer, Andrew Beck and Janine Chandler, and is published by Bite-Sized Books. I think you might find it stimulating. Now, if you'd like to support us, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Just head to patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. As a thank you, you'll also receive my weekly blog where I share some reflections on the week's interview. You don't have to read it, but I hope you'll find it engaging and thought-provoking. And that's all for this week. The podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.